Show y'all I could have rapped instead of playing basketball for real. You're let's do that. Ashkara. At the end of every unit, your teacher has the chance to teach a lesson about her lessons in a context to enhance. But what do you suppose our teacher has us do? He skips the lesson and makes us present a digital LEQ. Elocution needs historical evidence, reasoning that can corroborate and advance a complex thesis that Dr. John P. Iris would admire. Then we drop the screencast like a single that is fire. Student create a screencast for you to like, subscribe, and share. We know you've had all the John Green and Steve Heimler you can bear. If we had the most views by 10 p.m. Eastern on the 5th day, we earn 500 bonus points, which virtually guarantees an A. Without much more fanfare or ado, we present our digital LEQ. Swag.
Welcome to our digital LEQ project. The topic being discussed today is comparison. Analyze and compare the differing responses of China and Japan to Western pressure in the 19th century. Now onto our big idea questions that you should be able to answer by the end of this video. The first question is, what were the differences in the outcomes of the differing responses of Japan and China to Western trading pressure? And why is understanding the significance of holding on to tradition important in the comparison of Japan and China's responses to Western pressure? Now onto our thesis. Many assume that the responses of Japan and China to Western trading pressure were the same because they resulted in Japan and China both having to sign unequal treaties. However, Japan accepted Western trading requests and began to industrialize, while China denied their trading requests and rejected industrialization. Therefore, although China and Japan came from similar isolationist backgrounds, Western pressure was responded to differently by both countries. Now on to contextualization, which will give you more background information on the topic being discussed. In the 15th century, China's foreign policy became predominantly isolationist. However, the foreign policy of Japan did not become isolationist until the 17th century. Both countries had a desire to prevent foreigners from influencing their traditional values and felt as though they were self-sufficient. Therefore, once the West tried to pressure Japan and China in the 19th century, they were both reluctant to accept their trading requests. With the rise of industrialization and the West dominating power, having trading ports open to them in both China and Japan was seen as a great advantage. Now the four countries being discussed today are China, Japan, and the West, which is the United States and Britain. Now on to our first piece of historical evidence, which is the Treaty of Kanagawa, which was the first treaty signed by both the United States and Japan when Japan finally agreed to their trading requests. And the third article of this treaty is as follows. The port of Samoda in the Principality of Idzu and the port of Hakodate in the Principality of Matsumai are granted by the Japanese as ports for the reception of American ships, where they can be supplied with wood, water, provisions, and coal, and other articles their necessities may require, as far as the Japanese have them. Now, this primary source demonstrates Japan's response to Western pressure and shows how they finally agreed to Western trading requests. This piece of evidence corroborates the thesis because it is an explicit example of how Japan handled and responded to Western pressure. The source is an avid example of an unequal treaty that Japan had to sign with the West, as it describes how American ships were essentially protected by the Japanese and were given supplies at these ports. The point of view of this source is significant because it shows firsthand the interaction and agreement between Japan and the West. This evidence was retrieved from the Digital Public Library of America, and the purpose of this source was to reveal the treaty that led to Japan's break from isolationism to the public. The audience that this evidence was made for were the people of America.
Now into our second piece of historical evidence. This quote was the Qianlong Emperor's response to Britain's request to open up trading ports in China. This quote states that China will only keep that one port in Macau and that there will be no way for Britain to trade with China, and that they wanted to maintain their isolationist nation's origin. And this quote states, "Your nation has obediently complied with this regulation for years past without raising up any objection, and none of the other ports named Hongs have been established, so that even if your vessels were to proceed there, they would have no means of disposing their cargoes. Furthermore, no interpreters are available, so you would have no means of explaining your wants, and nothing but general inconvenience would result. For the future, as in the past, I decree that your request is refused, and that trade shall be limited to Macau." Analysis of reasoning for this would be, this primary source demonstrates how China was determined to stay isolated from Western powers. The Qianlong Emperor was adamant on being an isolationist nation, as he says, and none of the other ports named Hongs have been established, so that even if your vessels were to proceed there, they would have no means of disposing their cargoes. This corroborates with our thesis to show how China was an isolationist nation prior to being economically pressured by Western powers. Now into a next piece of historical evidence. This is the Treaty of Nanking, which was the quote-unquote peace treaty that ended the Opium War, where Britain was beating China by a sizable margin. This treaty was later then crowned one of the unequal treaties, where China was forced to concede their sovereignty rights in return for little to nothing. To the reasoning and analysis behind this. The Treaty of Nanking was the treaty that ended the Opium War, where Britain was beating China. This treaty not only allowed full protection of British people in China, but opened up ports in China to export their goods from, and gave Britain $21 million over the span of 21 years. This corroborates with our thesis that China was forced to sign an unequal treaty. Now, for the situation and point of view, to help give you a situation, a point of view about what happened. This Treaty of Nanking was written by British representatives to stop the war and bring quote-unquote peace between Britain and China. The treaty ended up doing much more than that. The historical situation where Japan started out as an isolationist nation that only had one port out of Macau, leading up to the Opium War, and then finally being forced to open up their trading ports through the Treaty of Nanking and paying a huge price while doing so, relates to our thesis and how China was pressured by Western powers and failed to industrialize.
This talks about the rise of the Meiji government, who introduced the twin policies of Fukoku Kyohei, which meant wealthy country, strong military. These policies drove Japan towards self-strengthening and stability through industrialization and militarization to ensure that they would never be forced into unequal treaties by any Western powers again. This evidence corroborates with the thesis as to how Japan reacted to trading requests, and that unequal treaties motivated them to never allow themselves to be overpowered ever again. This modifies our thesis because it shows the other measures Japan took to self-strengthen and industrialize, and even did so using some Western methods.
This picture explains how China was sectioned off by Western powers which competed for influence to gain economic advantages. This kept China under influence of Western powers while Japan was able to modernize. China isn't truly able to fully break away from European influence until Hong Kong is returned in the late 1990s. This qualifies our thesis because China isolated itself, which eventually causes them to resist and isolate themselves from the influence of Western pressure. Their economy began to decline drastically. Their fall began to show when China went from being a leading civilization to a struggling economy. China was then forced to open some ports to Western trade because they lost the war with Britain. British opened multiple ports to trade with Europe after losing the Opium War.
Alright, for theme 2, which was cultural developments and interactions, Europeans residing in Asia attempted to influence and overthrow Asian authorities due to their belief that God and the Pope were the highest authorities in the world. For economic systems, Western powers wanted access to Asia for foreign trade, and when they didn't get that, they threatened China and Japan with a superior military and forced them into treaties where they had to open up their ports for trade. For social interactions organizations, trade between Asia and the West continued, which also resulted in the trading of new ideas, religions, and cultures, which were taken back to the West and even introduced in the East.
To conclude this video, we're going to go over those big idea questions that were mentioned at the start of the screencast. By now, you should be able to answer them. The questions were as follows. What were the differences in the outcomes of the differing responses of Japan and China to Western trading pressures? And why is understanding the significance of holding on to tradition important in the comparison of Japan and China's responses to Western pressure? Pause this video now to come up with your answer. Now, the answer that we obtained for the first question is that the differences in the outcomes of the differing responses of Japan and China to Western trading pressure were that Japan began to industrialize and flourished economically, while China's rejection of industrialization and different ideas caused them to weaken and struggle economically. Now, the answer that we obtained for the second question was that understanding the significance of holding on to tradition is important in the comparison of Japan and China's responses to Western pressure because it was a key factor in China's rejection to Western trading requests, and it was the primary reason why China ended up the way that it did. Now, here are all of our sources, and thank you for watching.